We are living in a world with incredible constraints. The last couple of years, we've not been able to travel. We've been having to wear masks. There's so many things in the grocery stores that haven't been available. What constraints we have had in our lives. But it's important to remember that constraints are a normal part of our lives. Whether it's food or time or money or space or water or health, these are things that are constraints that we have in many different parts of our lives all the time. And I would argue that these constraints can actually be incredibly important stimulators of innovation and creativity in our lives. Because constraints push us out of our comfort zone and they force us to look at everything through fresh eyes and to question everything. I want you to consider this old puzzle, which many of you might have seen before. It's a puzzle with 9 dots, and your challenge is to connect all of these dots with 4 lines without moving your pen from the paper. And one of the classic solutions to this puzzle is to think outside the box by drawing lines outside the constraints of these 9 dots. And in fact, the term that we use all the time, think outside the box, as a symbol of creativity, came from this puzzle. But what if you have constraints that force you inside the puzzle? What if you have to be constrained by those 9 dots? In those situations, you need to think inside the box and look at what you do have as opposed to things you wish you had. So let's look at some examples to see how this works. Let's go back to 1970 and Apollo 13. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Apollo 13. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. This is such a true story and so dramatic. The astronauts were on their way to the moon. And on the way there, an oxygen tank blew up. Not only did this explosion damage a lot of things, but it meant they didn't have the oxygen they needed to make it on their journey. And the carbon dioxide levels in the cabin started increasing. They had limited time, they had limited resources, and lives were at stake. And in this situation, they had to look at only the things they had on the space capsule as opposed to anything else that they could get, because guess what? They were in the middle of space. And the way they solved this problem was so unique. They were able to take all the materials they had on the spaceship, including pulling the cover off the manual and using it as building materials instead of looking at it just as a cover of a manual. This creativity came from the incredible constraints they had trying to solve this dire problem. You can also look at this from the perspective of humor. Maybe you're familiar with Monty Python, the comedy troupe. Well, they are known for doing lots of wild and crazy things. And one of their famous movies is Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And in this movie, the original script called for having a beautiful stallion, a horse, coming over the hill with a beautiful knight in shining armor sitting on his back. Well, they said, there's no way. We can't afford a horse. What are we going to do? They had a very tiny budget for this film. So they thought and thought and thought, what do I have? I don't have a horse, but guess what? I've got some coconut shells. And so they banged the shells together in the same way that it would sound like a horse. And they ended up creating something that is one of the most iconic and funny scenes in any of their movies. Had they had enough money to buy a horse, to rent a horse, to use any horse, they would have done that, right? They would have used a horse. But by having that constraint of limited resources, they came up with something that was so much better. Now, you can go back in time to haiku, which of course was developed in Japan. And the concept of having a poem that is only limited to 5 syllables, 7 syllables, followed by 5 syllables, and having a poem that needed to capture the essence of life through the visions of nature. That's a lot of constraints, but think of all the beautiful poetry that has resulted. Here's a very famous haiku, The Old Pond. An old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. Splash, silence again. It's beautiful and it's meaningful on so many levels. Here are some examples, right, that you just saw. Then there's a 6-word memoir. This is supposedly Ernest Hemingway was asked, can you tell your life story in 6 words? And apparently he said, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. A very sad story. So there are so many examples that you can find online of 6-word memoirs. And I often use this as a tool in my classes where I ask my students to introduce themselves with their own 6-word memoir. Here are a few examples. I am disabled, but not helpless. Stuck on repeat, and hobby became job, seeking new hobby. So I invite you, if you want, to think of your 6-word memoir. How would you introduce yourself if you only had 6 words? Now, today, a lot of us use Twitter, which is a tool for, of course, putting out very short messages. They started out 140 characters to say something important to the world. I think of it like a little bumper sticker on the back of your car. So when the pandemic started, I thought, what can I do to be helpful? I just wanted to do something. And the first thing I thought of was to teaching a course only using Twitter messages. And so I came up with the idea of creating bite-sized classes, each one called a jolt that was just 1 tweet. So here was what I wrote. Join me for a series of bite-sized classes called jolts, delivered only with tweets. Each jolt would include a short video and a tiny assignment, and all the video clips come from our eCorner collection. This was such a fun exercise. I did this over the course of a month, just 1 month of tweets, 30 of them, super fun. Here's an example, jolt number 8. Creativity loves constraints. Perfect, right? A classic clip from Marissa Mayer, and there's a link, and their homework is to talk about what constraints they have now and how they've stimulated creativity. And here's an example of one of the responses. I can no longer travel and I'm meeting fascinating new people, but tons of fascinating people. I can no longer travel and meet fascinating people, but tons of fascinating people offer webinars or talks on Zoom or other platforms. And in all honesty, I've never met so many interesting people as I do now, which inspires me to be more interesting myself. So this is a good example of where I put out a tiny little tweet and all of these people came around and were inspired by it to do something creative, starting with this very tiny constraint. Now, I have a lot of experience teaching with constraints. I've been teaching for the last 8 years at San Quentin State Prison. And at San Quentin State Prison, I've been working with a program called The Last Mile, where they teach both entrepreneurship and coding skills to the men in the prison. And I have been teaching classes on entrepreneurship to help the men in the prison learn how to take their ideas and to bring them to life. At the beginning of each project that I launch, I start with 1 word. That's a constraint I give myself. It's a 1-word prompt. It might be sleep or memory or love or secrets or wildfires. And over the course of the time I teach them, over many weeks, they have to define the problem they're solving. They have to generate lots of ideas. They have to pick their favorite ideas and figure out how to test them. And at the end, they have to present a video. They have to make a video that tells the story of their idea. Now, they look at me at the end of the class and they say, how are we going to make a video? We're in prison. We don't have cameras. We don't have editing equipment. How are we possibly going to make a video? And I say to them, don't worry about it. Creativity loves constraints. I'm sure that you're going to figure out how you can make a video with the materials that you have available to you. And I come back 2 weeks later. And I can promise you, both they and me, we are all blown away by the incredible things that they've done. I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to show you a video done by one of the teams where the challenge and the topic was wildfires. And in this class, they had to figure out different problems they needed to solve around wildfires, come up with their solutions, and then share their idea. I picked wildfires for several reasons. First of all, we in California were dealing with terrible wildfires that year. In addition, the men in prison are very much captive, right? The fires and the smoke reaches them and they can't leave. Their family members are very much affected by the fires. And finally, the men who are in the prison often work side by side with the firefighters to try to attack the fires. So I'm going to share an example of one of the stories that they told about a product they came up with that allowed people to get evacuated when a fire was coming to their neighborhood. Here's the video. Pretty amazing. Could you imagine these folks did this in prison without any tools that you would normally have at your disposal? So yes, constraints stimulate the imagination. And I love this quote by the artist Phil Hansen, who says, "We first need to be limited before we become limitless." And he knows about this. He's an artist who used to, when he started, he was an expert in pointillism. This was making lots and lots and lots of tiny dots to make a painting. But he did this so long and so much that he ended up developing a tremor in his hand. And he went to doctor after doctor after doctor to figure out if there was a solution. And at some point, one of the doctors said, "You know what, Phil, you need to embrace the shake. There's nothing we can do about it. You need to figure out how to work with this limit as opposed to fighting it." And that's exactly what he did. He changed the way he created art completely. This is an example of using the pointillism ideas, but using stamps as opposed to dots. And if you look at the work that he's created, it is so much more creative that once he had this limitation than before he started. In fact, so many of us did this during the pandemic. This is an example of a project that came out of the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. When the pandemic started, they said, please try to replicate the artwork that is in the Getty Museum using objects you have around your own house. And this is one of my friends. We did this with a group of my friends. This is a painting of Whistler's Mother, a very famous painting. And my friend Teresa replicating it, using items in her house, including a Corona beer bottle, making the exact same painting. Or her daughter, this is Frida Kahlo's self-portrait that she did using things around her house. Or Wayne Thiebaud's pastries that were done using face masks. And finally, this is Sunflowers by Van Gogh using kitchen utensils. Pretty fun. We all know that during the pandemic, we have all been finding lots of creative ways to entertain each other, to entertain ourselves, and to certainly get our work done. This is true with doctors from around the world who have worked together tirelessly to figure out how to solve all the problems, including coming up with really breakthrough vaccines. So yes, constraints can be motivating, but let's dive deeper now to look at how they really work, because there are several different types of constraints. There are input constraints. Now, input constraints are the constraints of all the resources you have, like how much money do you have? How many people do you have? What space do you have? All the inputs you use to try to solve the problem. Then there are process constraints. You need to use these tools, or you need to use this methodology, all of the process constraints you need. And finally, there are output constraints. The constraints on the product you make has to cost less than $5, or it needs to fit in your back pocket, or it needs to be something easy enough for a 5-year-old to use. So when you're thinking of constraints, you need to think about the constraints in the inputs, the constraints in the process, and the constraints in the output. In addition, you can look at what type of constraints lead to creativity and innovation, and what constraints actually decrease it. I love this framework, which I've modified, looking at high and low creativity as a result of high and low constraints. So let's break this down. There are situations where there's very high creativity when there are very high constraints. This is like Apollo 13, really high risk, really high pressure, and your creativity is through the roof. However, if this exists for way too long, at some point, you're going to feel like you're on a treadmill. Think of what's happened over 2 years of the pandemic. Instead of feeling the mission we felt at the beginning, you might start feeling exhausted and drained. So understanding that high constraints can be very, very stimulating if they take place over a relatively short period of time. Then there are times when low constraints lead to high creativity. This is when you're on an expedition. Think about it when you're on vacation, when you're taking a walk, when there's no pressure on you and your mind is wandering and you're coming up with lots of ideas. But if that happens for too long and there aren't enough constraints, at some point you feel like you're on autopilot and you need something to really get you excited and motivated. So as an individual and also as a leader of a team or an organization, you can think about which of these situations what do you want to do to stay above the line, to go between being in expedition and being on a mission, as opposed to falling below the line where you're on autopilot and a treadmill. You want to stay above that line. So I spent a lot of time in my classes teaching students how to think about their problems they solve through the lens of different constraints. And there are many different experiments I do with them that allow them to learn these tools. So I'm going to share with you some of the projects I do with my students that allow them to learn these tools. The first is to change the frame. Now, what do I mean by this? It's something very subtle and very important. In fact, I would tell you this is the most important thing I teach in any of my classes. So let's imagine that we all work in an umbrella company, and we decide that we're going to make a brand new type of umbrella. And we could come up with all sorts of interesting things to do. We're going to make it different colors, or we're going to make it taller, or we're going to make it bigger, or we're going to make sure that the points on the edge are not so pointy. All of these things would improve the umbrella. And we would think that we've done a really good job and we've been very innovative. But the constraint is the question we asked. The question we asked was, how do we make a better umbrella? What if we change that question? What if we open up the frame? We open up the frame of the question and say, why do we use an umbrella in the first place? Pretty simple, right? We use an umbrella to stay dry in the rain. But if we answer that question, we change the question from how do we make a better umbrella to how do we stay dry in the rain, we now have an entirely new set of solutions, right? We can, instead of an umbrella, we can maybe have a new raincoat, or maybe we have awnings, or maybe we make tunnels, or maybe we have hot air that blows up from the ground so the rain never touches us. The fact is, the person who solves that problem of not getting wet in the rain is going to put the umbrella companies out of business. The people who had a tiny frame around the question around how do I make a better umbrella have missed the opportunity to think more broadly about what the real problem is. There are times in which the question you ask is very obvious, making an umbrella and staying dry in the rain. But sometimes it's much more subtle. Let me give you an example. Let's say instead of an umbrella company, let's say we made suitcases for traveling. And we decided we wanted to make a better suitcase. And we could come up with better wheels and a better handle and maybe different compartments that fit inside. But someone could come up with a different question and say, why do we use a suitcase in the first place? Now, this is a much more tricky problem. People might quickly say, well, of course, to carry our things. But that's not really why we carry a suitcase. Because nobody wants to have to carry their things. That is a burden. We carry our things because we need to have our possessions at our destination. So the real problem we're trying to solve is, how might I have the things I need at my destination? And what if you said, I can't use a suitcase? How might I have the things I need at my destination without a suitcase? And this is where the magic happens. You start coming up with other solutions. Well, what if we had a suitcase that traveled separately from me? What if I could rent clothes at my destination? What if I could 3D print clothes so that every time I wanted something, I just printed it out, and when I'm done with it, I melted it down again? Or maybe we change the way we think about clothes in the first place. Maybe we all wear a uniform, and so we don't have to have a suitcase. We don't have to change our clothes every day. Or maybe we have clothes that clean themselves. The solutions are endless, but we'd never be able to come up with these really innovative solutions unless we questioned the question we ask. In fact, Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, if I had a daunting problem to solve, if my life depended upon the solution, and if I had 1 hour to solve the problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem and questioning the question I was asked. Because once you come up with the right question, the answer will become obvious. So that's one of the things that you should think about in order to think about constraints in creative problem solving, is change the constraint of the question you're asking in order to unlock new solutions. The second thing is to flip things around. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, instead of looking at the great ideas and the solutions to the problem you're trying to solve, what about coming up with the worst ideas? I do this in my classes all the time, where I have the students brainstorm the best ideas they can come up with for something. It might be a family vacation or a new restaurant. And then I rip up all of those solutions and I ask them to come up with the worst ideas instead. Because the good ideas are pretty incremental, right? If I asked you to come up with a great idea for a family vacation, you're going to end up on a beautiful island or on a cruise or going to Disneyland, going to Hawaii, something expected. But when I ask you to come up with the crazy, terrible ideas, you're going to end up, I don't know, you're going to end up in a garbage dump. You're going to end up in a prison. You're going to end up, getting sick. And there's always the seed of something very interesting in those crazy, horrible, no good, terrible ideas. Imagine, for example, that I asked you to come up with a bad idea for a restaurant. You might say a restaurant where they serve rotten food. Say, well, that sounds like a terrible idea. But maybe you say, rotten food, maybe it's not rotten. Maybe it's leftover food from a really fancy restaurant. It's the food that they were going to throw out that was extra. And we take that and we serve it at a much lower price at the second restaurant next door. Or maybe it's a restaurant where they say you have to make your own food. Well, that doesn't sound like fun. But what if they have all the ingredients they have, and you get to pick all your favorite ingredients, and they're going to come up with some clever recipe using just the things you wanted. The fact is, every bad idea is the seed of something really interesting, and that's where the innovation comes in. So if you give yourself the constraint or give your team the constraint of coming up with terrible ideas, you're going to end up coming up with ways to generate very innovative solutions. Finally, I like to squeeze, and that is squeezing the time. Instead of saying, let's solve this problem over the next few weeks, and I will say, we're going to solve it in the next few days, or we're going to solve it in the next few hours, or we're going to solve it in the next few minutes. I sometimes do this. I'll give the students a challenge. I'll say, you are the designers in a greeting card company, and your job is to come up with a line of greeting cards. Maybe it's for Earth Day, or for Mother's Day, or for Best Friend Day. And first I give them an hour to do it. Then I'll give them a new holiday and say, instead of an hour, you've got 10 minutes. And they realize that having a very small amount of time, by squeezing that down, they end up generating many more ideas very, very quickly. So I want to just recap. You can change the frame, that is, change the question you ask. Then when you ask the question, you could come up with the worst ideas as well as the best ideas and throw out the good ideas. And you can also limit the amount of time so that you really give yourself a lot of constraints to come up with something truly innovative. I love this quote from Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists of not seeking new landscapes, but in seeing with new eyes. And that's what happens when you have constraints. You have to look at the world through fresh eyes and see the things you have as opposed to the things you wanted to have. Yes, necessity is the mother of invention. But if that's the case, then constraints are the father. And together, they end up generating incredibly innovative ideas. Thank you. Great. That's such an important question. It is very important for all entrepreneurs at whatever stage of their business to have resilience. It is obvious that over the course of one's entrepreneurial adventures, there are going to be failures. There are going to be things that's small and big that don't work out as you expected or as you hoped, and you need to be able to recover. If you can't recover from failure, if you can't be resilient, you're never going to be able to be successful. In fact, failure is part of the process of developing and building something big. And you need to understand that that is a very expected part of the process. One of the things I do with my students is I have them think about, what does failure mean to them? What does the bottom feel like when they fail? And it's so interesting because some people, the bottom is made of rubber and they bounce, right? They have a lot of resilience. But for other people, they feel like the bottom is made of concrete or is made of fire or broken glass. And they feel like if they fail, they're going to basically die. And I remind them that this is all in their head. They're certainly not going to die if they fail, and that they need to develop a mindset of resilience, because if they don't, they're never going to be successful. Great. So I think there are two things that I think are very, very important to develop. And they're things that we teach in our classes and that I see in our community here at Stanford. One is curiosity. The most important thing about curiosity is that it makes your eyes open to the new things around you, where you start seeing problems that need to get solved and solutions that might be in your midst. And so being open-minded and being willing to explore things that you don't know anything about is incredibly important. That's one of the things that's also important when you're a student, is to just be open-minded and willing to explore things that are new to you. But in addition, it's important to start figuring out, how do you build trust with other people? You are never going to be able to make your dreams come true unless you work and collaborate with others. And being able to collaborate is just a core part of any venture. And so, yes, there's curiosity, you're learning other things individually, but ultimately you need to bring together a group of community, a group of people who trust each other and are able to work together to bring bold ideas to life. Next question. Great. So my students spend a lot of time, of course, in their classes, but they spend just as much time outside of their classes exploring their interests, their hobbies, their passions. And this is really important because this is a time when you really get to explore and try lots of things. Being in college is a time in your life where failure has a very low risk. You know, you try things, they don't work out, you go on to the next thing. And so you see lots of people starting companies, starting nonprofits, starting all sorts of projects that they can try out and experiment with while they're in school. Yeah, so this is such a good question. I meet with students all the time who are really worried about the choices they're going to make. And there are some very important things to keep in mind. First of all, you have a fantasy in your mind of what's going to happen, and you're probably wrong. I have students who are agonizing about a summer internship, a job they're going to take between their junior and senior year. And they agonize and ultimately make a decision. And when they come back in the fall and I ask them, how was your summer experience? How close was it to what you expected? And they almost always say it was totally different than they imagined. And that's going to be true with every single thing you do in life. You're going to have an imagining of what it's going to be like, but in reality, it's going to be different. So I urge you to not get so hung up imagining what things will be, but just go out and try it. Just try it. You're going to learn something. Even the things you do that are the biggest failures or the biggest disappointments can be the biggest learning opportunities for you. And that's really important because especially at this point in your life, your job should be about learning. It should not be about feeling like you need to make a huge contribution. Your job is continuing to learn when you're young, when you're in your 20s. The other thing to keep in mind is that you have a very long life ahead of you, and you don't have to make decisions now that are going to be the same 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now. You have a long time to experiment. In fact, I can tell you that I came back to Stanford 23 years ago today, and I was 41 years old. I did lots and lots of experimenting between 25 and 40, right? 15 years of experimenting before I ended up taking a job that I ended up staying in for 23 years. And keep that in mind, that you don't have to be right the first time with the first opportunity you take. It's going to be an opportunity to learn, and the world is going to unfold in front of you in exciting and unpredictable ways. Next question. Did I notice anything during the coronavirus pandemic? So yes, I noticed so many new things during the pandemic. It was so interesting. And I think that what happened is during that point of time where we went from life seeming normal to all of a sudden we were in a pandemic, that happened so quickly that it was a time where you got to see what you and what other people were really like. You got to see whether you were someone who led with fear. Was this about fear? Was this about problem solving? Was this about making a contribution to your community? And I noticed that every person approached the pandemic in a very different way, and that this told you something about yourself and it told you about other people. I know that for me, it was very interesting. My first reaction is, what can I do to be helpful? This is why I started teaching a class on Twitter. I put together an entire summer internship program online for 80 students who had lost their summer jobs. My go-to was to try to solve problems. And it was interesting to see how other people did the same or something different. Sometimes people said the most important thing was connecting with their friends. And they started doing Zoom cocktail parties and figuring out all sorts of ways to connect, even if we couldn't be in the same room. So I invite you to think about what you did during the pandemic. What happened at the beginning? And what does that tell you about the way that you're engaging in the world? And you can ask me anything. What's the most regrettable mistake I have ever made? I make mistakes every single day. You know, I have gotten very used to making mistakes and then figuring out how to recover. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is about who do I want to be in the world? And I want to be someone who has a lot of resilience, who recovers from mistakes. I have learned how to say I'm sorry, to say I made a mistake, and to move on. It used to be that when I was younger, and I'm going to guess that some people are listening might feel the same way, that when I made a mistake, I was very, very upset. And I beat myself up, and I spent a long time, sometimes years being upset about the mistakes I made. But being able to acknowledge a mistake, to apologize for a mistake, and to move on and to learn from that mistake is one of the most powerful things you can do in your life. So I don't actually look at my mistakes now as something that I regret, because every single mistake was a learning opportunity. I think about in my personal life, in my professional life, in my academic life, I've made so many mistakes. I think about in my book, What I Wish I Knew When I Was 20, I put my own failure resume in the book, showing the mistakes I've made. When I started college, I was not a very good student. It took me a long time to learn how to learn and to be the curious person that I am today. And so even though I made that mistake when I was young, I was able to correct for it as I got older. Or maybe I had a relationship and I broke up with a boyfriend in a way that I was somewhat embarrassed by if I think about it now. But you know what? I was only 21 years old. I certainly wouldn't do it now that I'm older. And so I look back on those mistakes as the fact that I was doing something that was hard the first time, and that just like anything else that we do hard the first time, you're going to make mistakes. Think about it. How many of you walked the first time you tried, or rode a bicycle the first time you tried? It was expected that you would fall, that you would trip, that you would have to get up again and again before you did it right. We should have the same grace with ourselves when we're adults, expecting that there are going to be mistakes and learning from them. Next question. Okay, great. So the question really is, how do you not regret your choices? Because you're going to have a lot of them. Every single day we're making choices. The one thing I would say is in most cases, you're not burning bridges. And you need to just make a decision about what you're going to do and try it. See what is going to happen. You don't know. And one of the things that I teach my students all the time is you don't get a job, you get the keys to the building. Think about it. You walk in, if you just do the job that has been expected of you, the one that's written on the job description, you've limited yourself. If you do that job, and then you see other places you can contribute and other opportunities in the organization, you're going to keep growing and growing and growing. So regret is something that I urge you to eliminate from your vocabulary so that you can go out there, try lots of things, keep what works, learn from the things that didn't work out well, and move on to the next thing. Often it's extremely powerful to quit a job. You know, if something isn't working, you can certainly leave, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't at least try. So please try to leave regret at the door. Okay, one message to those who are going to start a business. What would it be? It would be that you should try okay, you know what? I have a really important answer to this. I teach a class called Inventing the Future. And it's one of the most fun classes I teach at Stanford. And the goal of the class is to prepare young entrepreneurs how to anticipate both the positive and the negative implications of the things that they invent and the companies that they start. Think of the companies that are out there now in the world and the positive and the negative consequences of that technology. I want you, when you start your company, when you start your organizations, to think not just of the positive things that can happen, but also think about the negative things. What are the negative consequences that you need to make sure to mitigate as you are designing the company? Let me give you an example. Let's say you're back 150 years ago and you're inventing a car, and you think of all the wonderful things that you can do with an automobile. But if you were smart then, you would have thought, you know, if I have an internal combustion engine, there's going to be a lot of pollution that goes out into the atmosphere. And if you can anticipate that a car is going to cause air pollution by extrapolating, if there are so many cars in the world, what's going to happen to the air? At that point, you could have said, let's build the car in a way so that we don't end up causing air pollution. And this is true with so many other things. If you can try to anticipate the consequences of that technology, then you could mitigate it. Think about privacy issues online. Think about all sorts of things that have entered our world. And so in my class, we pick frontier technology like virtual reality dating, or mining asteroids, or bringing extinct species back to life. And ask the students to think, we give them tools to think about what are the positive and the negative consequences, and then to talk about and think about the things that can be done to prevent the negative consequences. So that's my advice to you, is to don't be just so positive, also think of the negative consequences so that you can try to prevent them. Yeah. So we all go through slumps, don't we? I mean, nobody's life is a perfect 10 all the time. And I think it's very important to realize that those slumps are a time for renewal. They're a time for doing deep thinking about what's really important to you and to be reflective about that. It's interesting because there's a program at Stanford called the Distinguished Career Institute. And it's for people who are in their 50s and 60s to come back and to learn how to reinvent their lives. These are people who are going through a slump at the end of their career and are trying to reinvent themselves. And it's important to keep in mind that those cycles happen throughout your life and to embrace it, not to expect that everything is going to be perfect all the time, but that those slumps are a part of the process and a time for reflection and renewal. I know that I like to keep a journal or a diary with ideas and thoughts. And during those slumps, you can go and mine it for ideas that might end up generating the energy you need to end up moving forward. Great. It is such a pleasure to speak in the global lecture series at Tokyo Metropolitan University. I have been to Japan several times. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and I can't wait to come back and visit again soon.